Our next guest is Professor Christelle Dumas. She's a professor of development economics at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. She seeks to understand how households from poor countries make crucial choices, how many children to get, whether to send them to school or to work, and always asking which policy could improve the well-being of these individuals. Her work has a strong empirical focus using data from African and Asian countries. Please join me now in welcoming Christelle.
Okay, so thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation. This is the last talk before lunch, and it has been proven that this one is the one that we don't listen too much to. So I've planned to make it short so that you can wake yourself up with your own questions afterwards. So what I would like to discuss with you today is the following thing. We have plenty of good reasons why we want to try and help people. And because you're sitting in this room, I'm not going to go through all these reasons because I'm pretty sure you have them clearly in mind. As a development economist, I'm particularly interested in how to relieve poverty in a very broad sense of poverty. So what I'm interested in is to understand how we can improve access of households to education, healthcare, improve their ability to satisfy their needs, improve their freedom of choice, and so on and so on. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, and as you will see, I will take various examples and not specific example on one specific goal. So I think we all agree on the idea that we have this goal of relieving poverty, and the main question is really how we should do that. And I'm not going to tell you how we should do that because I don't know. What I want to push forward today is the idea that there is a well-known proverb that is, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And maybe you are already convinced by that, in particular because you are again sitting here. Maybe you're not so convinced about that. So I would like to go in with examples of that. So my point is not to say that we shouldn't have good intentions. My point is not to say that we shouldn't do anything, but rather that if we are implementing interventions, programs, policies in order to help people, then we have to be extremely careful with what we're doing because potentially what we're doing might have adverse consequences on them. So if you're already convinced that this proverb is true, then what I will show you today is only additional evidence that will allow you to use as arguments when you try to convince people to join effective altruism. If you're not already convinced, then it's good because you will maybe learn something. The other thing that I would like to discuss with you today is how we can assess what we can do in order to avoid the interventions that we implement to be bad things for the people we want to help. So let me start with a policy that is very well known and that has been discussed just before for people who are sitting in this room. So aid. Public aid is clearly the most immediate tool that we can use in order to relieve poverty. But actually it's among the most debated questions in economics. Aid has its proponents. It's clear that we could eradicate poverty with even small amounts of donation done by people living in the rich world. But it also has its opponents. There are some people who argue that aid does more harm than good, first because it does not reach the poor people, and second because it comes with bad things like corruption, encouragement to public deficits, and so on. And actually, it's very difficult to have a definitive answer on that question. I expect that economists are going to fight against each other for the next decades, for about 8. Why is that difficult to have a definitive answer on that question? Simply because the countries who are the beneficiaries of aid differ markedly from the countries who are not beneficiaries of aid. And therefore, if we simply compare people who receive aid and people who don't receive aid, then we don't learn anything about the effect of aid itself. So I'd like to discuss not aid in general, but something that is a bit more specific. I would like to discuss about food aid first. And the reason why I've chosen food aid is simply because there are some scholars who have found a very nice way to identify some effects of food aid. There is a compelling argument in favor of food aid in the sense that it is very often provided to countries which face famines or very strong conflicts that prevent them from access to resources. So basically, food aid is provided in order to avoid the starvation of thousands of people. So that's a compelling argument in favor of it. The problem is that providing those resources to countries who face some conflicts, internal conflicts, for instance, might actually fuel this conflict in the sense that the people who are engaged in this conflict, the militias, might actually use the resources in order to to make the conflict last longer than what they could do if there was just no resources at all. The idea that and again, it's very difficult to assess the impact of food aid because the countries that are beneficiaries are, again, different from the ones that are non-beneficiaries. So how did Nathan Nunn and Nancy Chan deal with that problem? Well, actually, they came up with a very bright idea, which consists in assessing the fact that food aid is, in fact, largely determined by US agricultural stocks. So food aid is largely given by the US, and the US gives aid depending on how much stocks they have. That's what we are going to see in the next slide. So in this slide, we have one dot for each year going from 1971 to 2006. And the left graph plots the wheat stock detained by the US against the wheat production in the previous year. As you can see, there is a positive relationship between the two, which means that the US government buys the surpluses in wheat and stores them. Okay? And then in second graph, we have against a dot for each year going from 1971 to 2006, and it plots the food aid given by the US against the US stocks. And again, we have a positive relationship, which means that the US determine how much they send to poor countries as food aid based on how much stocks they have. Okay? It means something very interesting for the evaluation of the impact of food aid. It means that in some years, the US have larger wheat production, and then it will translate into larger stocks, and then it will translate into larger food aid. This means that in some years, there is variation in food aid that is not dependent on how much poor countries need food aid, but rather on how much the US are willing to send. Okay? And this factor that is independent of the need from the poor countries is what we call an exogenous factor. This can be used in order to evaluate the consequences food aid has on the poor countries, simply because we can match the years in which there is a higher production of wheat in the US, with the consequences in terms of conflict we observe in the next year. That's what is done in the next two graphs. In this slide, we have two graphs for the following reason. Actually, there are a non-negligible number of countries who never receive any food aid or very rarely receive food aid from the US. So those ones would not be affected by the increase in the production of wheat in the US simply because they just never receive anything from the US, okay? So on the left, we have those countries who are very irregular recipients of food aid. And on this graph, we have the average incidence of civil conflict plotted against the production of wheat in the US in the previous year. And we find clearly no relationship between the two. But now if we look at the countries which are regular recipients of food aid, we find that the civil conflict is positively related with the US wheat production in the previous year. This is bad news. This means that food aid impacts increases the incidence of conflict, okay? And we can quantify by how much providing more food aid increases conflict in the poor countries. This is written in the slide. It's not extremely important for my talk. So more precisely, what the authors show is that providing food aid doesn't create new conflict, but it allows the conflicts that have already started to last longer. So what do we do with that? It's a difficult question. We have the information based on that when we're trying to do good by sending food aid to poor countries, actually this might do more harm than good because the conflict will last longer and this will have consequences in terms of numbers of killed people and the length of the conflict. However, this does not say whether we should donate for hunger relief simply because there are also obviously positive sides of food aid, which is a number of lives that have been saved with providing the food to the people. So there are some benefits that are not taken into account in the study, but this study shows that a very well-intended policy which consists in providing food aid to poor people might actually lead to conflict. Let me take another example of a policy that might have unintended adverse consequences. India is one country where the maternal and infant mortality rates are pretty high. They're higher than in the poor neighbor countries surrounding India. So there is the idea that we could reduce maternal and infant mortality, and that would be completely in line with the Millennium Development Goals. So the Indian government has decided to implement a policy that consists in inducing women to give birth in hospitals so that women and the newborn can get some treatment more effectively. And in order to provide incentives to give birth in hospitals, they simply provide cash transfers for birth delivery at hospitals. Okay? So clearly, a policy that is very well intended and that allows that induces women to go more to the hospital. The problem with this policy is that, and I'm going to go quickly through that example, is that it has consequences in terms of fertility. The authors show that it leads to an increase in fertility simply because one provides payments for each newborn. Okay? So how do they do that? Well, they use the fact that the scheme hasn't been implemented exactly in the same way in the different states. So there are some low-performing states which have higher levels of infant and maternal mortality, and therefore in those states they were providing the cash transfers for any birth taking place at the hospital, while there are some other states that are considered the high-performing states, which is completely relative, obviously, but still have lower levels of mortality, and they were inducing women to go to the hospital only to a certain extent. So they were not providing cash transfers after the second child, and they were not providing cash transfers for the better off households. And so in the paper, they are comparing the states which are low-performing states with the ones that are better performing, and they use the households that are at the frontier with the idea that they must be similar, and they compare the outcomes in terms of fertility based on which scheme is implemented for these households. Okay? I'd like now to turn to my third example. It is about road infrastructure. I have made the choice of providing examples that are varied, and some of them are very macro, like the aid. Some of them are much more micro, the cash transfer to households, and road infrastructure lies in between. As economists, we tend to think that road infrastructure is a good thing for rural households because it should allow them to get better access to work opportunities, improve their ability to sell their farm production, and more generally have better access to healthcare or any type of public good. Okay? So that's the reason why we were interested in road infrastructure. So what we've decided to do with Jimena Khiativa, who is one of my PhD students, is to take advantage of the fact that Tanzania had decided to implement a road rehabilitation program. So it takes place within the 2005 strategy for growth and reduction of poverty, and it's the decision to invest for 10 years in the transport sector, and they have decided of 9 road corridors that had to be upgraded, which correspond broadly to 10,000 kilometers. So that's a major road rehabilitation program. So we knew that, and we had to use some data in order to evaluate the impact of the program. So the data we use are information that was collected by the World Bank with the Tanzania National Institute of Statistics, and basically what they are doing is they survey households spread all over the territory. So we have roughly 4,000 households that are interviewed in 2008, and then they are subsequently re-interviewed in 2010, 2012, and 2014. The round of 2014 won't be used for this analysis simply because it's not yet fully available. So let me show you, I'm not sure what you can see. So this is Tanzania. The red line here are the roads that are already paved in 2008, okay? And in between you have other types of roads, like those ones, for instance, who are only gravel rather than paved, okay? And you have, so the majority of roads are not paved, as you can see, and you have dots all around the place. You can see all those dots. Those are villages that are surveyed in the data we use. Okay? The orange one are the rural villages, and the blue one are the urban villages. Now, if we move to this map, we have additional lines, and those are the blue lines. Okay, this one, for instance. The blue lines are the roads that were previously gravel and that are rehabilitated so that they are paved during the period 2011-2013. As you can see, we have, let me take an example if I manage. Yeah, we have dots, like for instance this one, that is right on the road that has been rehabilitated. So this village, for instance, will be what we call a treated village, okay? In the sense that we expect households from this village to benefit from the road. Now, what is the strategy we implement? What we have to do is to define what we call a control group. A control group is a group of villages that are too far from the new roads to be affected by them, but that look similar to the treated villages before the implementation of the road rehabilitation program. So what we do is to define this control group based on the observed characteristics in 2008. And then we compare the evolution of the villages close to the new roads, so the treated villages, with the evolution of villages that look similar, the control villages. So let me show you. So here, if I want to take my same example as before, we have this village that is just very close to the road that has been rehabilitated. That's the yellow dots. And then we have the dark green dots, and those ones are the control villages. So it's further away from the road. So it can't be affected by the road, but it looks similar in the sense that it's close to a road that was previously in the same gravel than the other one, and it also has similar characteristics. Okay, so we will build this control group. And then we just look at the evolution. What we find that for rural households in Tanzania, we find that evident that road improvements actually led to changes in the allocation of work. So we observe that they spend less time working on their farm, more time working for somebody else. This might not be a bad outcome. It could be very positive. It could be that they have better access to work opportunities compared to earlier. This comes along with the fact that they also reduce how much they produce and how much they sell out of it. So we have sales that go down and harvests that go down. But if we look into greater detail, we also find that we have negative impacts in terms of welfare. So the households state more often that they have some distress with regard to their financial situation. We have a decrease as well in the assets they own. So it means that those changes come with a deterioration of their welfare. So how can we explain that? We explain that by the fact that when building these new roads, the villages get better connected with other villages, with the cities, and then they also get a better access with lots of other goods, and in particular goods that they were producing before. The prices of those goods go down simply because the transportation costs have decreased. So now the producers from the villages that were almost in autarky before, they face a very strong competition with goods that were produced from elsewhere. And because of this competition, because the price go down, they understand that it's not worth anymore producing those goods. And they reduce the production, their own production, and they have to find other means of subsistence. This is the reason why they increase of farm labor. But this comes at a cost, because clearly they have lower welfare and they have fewer assets than what they had before. So this is bad news for rural households. Let me go quickly through what we find for the urban households. We find fewer changes for the urban households simply because before they were already better connected. But if anything, we do find some increase in the welfare of urban households. They increase their consumption and they face less often shocks, such as large changes, large rises in the price of food. So if this is the effect of the policy, then we really have to worry in the sense that we are inducing a redistribution from poor rural households towards better off households living in urban areas. This is, again, a consequence that was not intended, that was not necessarily expected. So I think we have to take that into account when we are implementing such kind of programs. This being said, I'm willing to be very careful on these results simply because at the moment they are just based on short-term effects of the road construction. It could be the case that in the long run it is a positive change for the rural households, but we don't know yet. Okay? Okay, so where do we go from there? Well, we've seen that even the better intended interventions might lead to adverse effects. And I think this clearly advocates in favor of the idea of systematizing evaluations of what is implemented. We want to have evaluations run as systematically as possible in order to really build a corpus of knowledge of what are the consequences of such changes. It's important to be systematic because we don't expect that the same policies implemented in different places would have the same type of effects, simply because preferences of people are different, the environment is different, so they don't face the same constraints and they don't react in the same way to the same policies. And also, it's important to understand why it works or why it doesn't work. Okay? Sometimes the mechanism is fairly quick to understand, but sometimes it's not so easy. So building a corpus of knowledge also means that we have to go in depth into the understanding of the consequences. So I think it's legitimate to say that we should always be doubtful of the interventions or policies that are implemented with well-intended intentions, in the sense that it's not because it's well-intended that it has positive effects, and we should always question that. So how do we do that? Let me go quickly through the two main options we have, and I didn't want to go too much into details, but we can discuss it further if you want with the Q&A. So we can use experiments. When it is feasible, it's actually fairly easy to design experiments. So, for instance, you can imagine an NGO having an intervention which is to subsidize bed nets to eradicate malaria. Then, in order to properly evaluate the consequences of this subsidization, which would be, for instance, whether the bed nets are actually used for the kids, whether they actually purchase the bed nets, whether this has some consequences in terms of health, but also, like, for instance, in terms of ability to go to school and so on and so on. Then the NGO could choose a set of people who potentially could benefit from her point of view from the intervention. And then the process is to randomly allocate who benefits from the subsidy and who doesn't. And the randomness of the process guarantees that the beneficiaries and the non-beneficiaries are similar. And then it is sufficient to compare the outcomes of the treated and of the control individuals. There are some costs, obviously, because this necessitates some resources that are allocated to the evaluation in terms of time, in terms of data collection, which can be quite substantial. And it induces constraints in the sense that the NGO cannot change on its side simply who gets the intervention and who doesn't. Why is it useful to use those experiments? Because based on those experiments, it is straightforward to pin down the consequences of the intervention. And even for the people who suffer from the cost, like for instance the NGO, it is really a nice move to have those experiments implemented, simply because then it's very easy to communicate to funders, to politicians so as to get more funding or so as to scale up the intervention. Can we always implement an experiment? Likely not. There are a bunch of interventions that are implemented that actually do not bend themselves too well to experiments. Food aid is a good example of that. It would be very, very difficult from a political point of view to say we now randomly allocate food aid. Okay? Roads is another example of a difficult setup for an experiment, because we would have to build lots of roads in order to run their experiment, and this is extremely costly. So it would be also very difficult to convince a politician to randomly build roads. And very often there are interventions that have been implemented independently of a research design, so that we are left with no experiment that has taken place. So we have to find some ways to evaluate the consequences of those interventions. So I've shown you a couple of techniques very briefly. Those are called Econometrics Techniques, and they can be used in order to evaluate the consequences. Last thing, there are also some limitations to the experiments. I think I don't want to go too much into detail on that, but I think the main one is that very often, because those experiments are costly to run, they are run on a very small scale. Very often even a lower scale than what the NGO implements. And then it's very difficult to say what would be the effect if we were to scale up the intervention even at the country level. There is clearly a missing link here in in being able to assess whether this effect that we have identified on a couple of villages can be extended with confidence to a whole country. Okay. So just to conclude, with my red line on roads, so I think having those evaluations is actually the road to knowledge. It is a road that is a bit bumpy in the sense that it is a difficult road to systematically assess the consequences of what we're doing. But I think it's also our responsibility, if we are willing to improve the life of other people, then we have to be really sure that we are actually improving their life and not deteriorating them. So I think all of you, because you're sitting here, are convinced that it is a road that we should pursue. And I would like to thank you for your attendance, and I think you're on the right track, being in this room and being interested by effective altruism. Thank you.
Yes, thank you again for this very interesting talk and these very illustrating examples. As a statistician, I enjoyed it a lot to have this on-hand examples. And with this topic, there's one question ranked very high, which is, in my opinion, based on a misunderstanding. Maybe you can go back on the slide where you had the two graphs with the correlation on the two groups. I read out the question.
This one?
Yes, this one. I read out the question. It goes, conflict versus regularity of food aid. Is there omitted variable, correlation instead of cause? And there's another question asking, maybe longer conflicts cause more food aid to be sent.
Okay. So I think that the questions show that you have understood the problem, which is how that we can't do much with the correlation between food aid and conflict. What is shown here is not the correlation between food aid and conflict, but the correlation between how much the US have been producing in the year before and conflict. So this here on the axis is how much has been produced in the year before. And this is not how much is sent, it's just how much has been produced. And that will have some consequences on how much is sent. but the countries who receive it is not determined by how much has been produced in the previous year.
Yes, I hope this clarified some of the confusion. The second ranked question is from Brett. Maybe they can show their hand if they want to. It's over there, thank you. And the question is, what is more effective to end poverty? Wealth creation through economic growth or wealth distribution through tax?
Do I have a joker? No, I mean, this is one of the questions that is the most debated. So, I mean, you take two economists and they won't tell you the same thing, right? So, okay, I think that redistribution is extremely important. That also because wealth creation is a long-run process, and that poor people are poor now, and they need some relief now, not just in 10 years. But obviously, I'm not going to tell you that we should take all the wealth from the rich and give them to the poor. That doesn't have any sense, right? So. Okay, maybe I should have been more careful. So I'm not saying that all the well-intended interventions have bad effects. I'm just wanting to flag the fact that it might be the case, that can happen. And therefore that we have to first think thoroughly to all the adverse effect that it might have. And I mean, in the previous talk, there were questions about that also to Joanna. So I think it's something that you already have in mind. But it's also the case that very often we don't necessarily either expect everything bad that could happen. We don't foresee everything first, and also, so that's the reason why we also have to be a bit agnostic sometimes. It's a bit of both, right? Building on what we have read and what we have learned, and in order to get some ideas of what is the best way to implement a policy, but also sometimes being sufficiently agnostic to go for an evaluation of something we would expect to be a positive intervention.
Thank you. 24 people in this room are convinced and say, okay, it makes sense. So where should they put their money, in your opinion? Also, if you want to, you can raise your hand. It's okay if you don't want to.
24.
Oh, it's the neighbor. Hi.
I'm not going to answer that question simply because there are trade-offs. No, but I mean, we are trying to take decisions. We are trying to take informed decisions based on evidence, right? But at the end of the day, there are trade-offs. And on all of the examples that I've given, there are trade-offs. So, and the way we value the different, so trade-offs within policies, okay, interventions that have good sides and bad sides. So we already have to choose what is the predominant side that we should remember from this policy, but also when we compare the different NGOs or whatever, okay? They are doing good in different dimensions, and I think that this is an individual decision. Whether I personally believe that I should provide more resources to health or to education is something that cannot be answered, I think, on a normative basis. I think that each one of us has to decide in which cause he thinks he should put resources. I realize when I'm thinking to this question, I realize that I'm very much interested in education and health, and I realize that my natural answer would be that. But it might be a flaw in the sense that that's what I'm interested in, so yeah.
Thank you for the question. The next question asks about other food aid, because you talked about the consequences of food aid by the US government, and someone is asking if you have, or how would you evaluate food aid given by health humanitarian organizations? Are there differences? Again, if you want to, you can raise your hand. Oh, here in the front. Thank you for the question.
Okay. That's an interesting question. I don't know of a study that would be on food aid provided by other institutions. So also because basically, as you've seen, I mean, the main reason why the study has been run is because it came with this brilliant idea of using the behavior of the US in the allocation of aid, right? So we always have to find for something that allows in the evaluation, which is very difficult. That's probably the reason why there is no something. I mean, there must be some papers. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of papers on all those questions. So there must be some papers, but I don't know any that is very convincing in terms of evaluation. This being said, there are a bunch of papers on the comparison of aid donors and the way, so not food aid, but aid donors, like different countries donating, and their behavior and how politically biased they are. And we observe quite a lot of differences depending on countries, with some European countries being very much biased by their former colonial links, countries from the northern part of Europe being much less biased, and then some countries biased a lot by the votes they can buy at the UN. So there are lots of papers on that question, and we do expect as well that this might have some consequences, different consequences as well in terms of the good it might do in the poor countries.
You have a question on that?
Okay, if you go and read this paper, it's actually a very nice paper. If you go and read this paper, they have a couple of statements based on the way food aid is provided in places where there are some conflicts. And they are very clear on the fact that in order to access the area of conflict and to provide the food, then they have to basically bribe all the militias they go through in order to reach place. So clearly that's part of the very bad aspect that those militias manage to grasp a non-negligible share of the aid that is provided. So now the question is whether humanitarian aid managed to avoid that. I don't think it's the case. And if I remember well, the paper starts by a statement by Médecins Sans Frontières, which clearly say that they don't know if what they're doing does more good than harm or the opposite. So.
But if we understand it right, it's not solely the food itself, but its side effects due to, for example, bribing the local militia. But is there also a causal effect of the food itself?
I'm not sure I understand the question in the sense that bribing will be in part simply giving away a part of the food that is there. And plus, the question is then, if we were able to provide the food without bribing, then I would expect them to do it, right? Otherwise, So it comes hand in hand. That's the causal effect of providing food aid.
But for example, if in the future we have the chance to provide the food without the bribing, is it still a negative cause for the conflict? Because, for example, the soldiers can be stronger.
On both sides. So it would make the conflict last longer. So yeah, they're not really getting into the detail of what is the exact mechanism, where the resources are going, but the idea is exactly that we provide resources that allow the different parties of the conflict to sustain their negative activity.
So, because there was a question on that, it's so both direct and indirect effects of the food help. Felix asks a question if it wouldn't be easier to support local agriculture in poor countries instead of sending food aid.
If it would be?
Easier to support local agriculture in the poor countries instead of sending from other countries the poor aid.
Okay, so that's one of the question that was a bit raised in the previous talk. I don't know if you were here. But there is indeed lots of papers that now show that providing food aid is actually quite inefficient because there is a lot of loss in the process of providing food aid. It costs a lot compared to sending cash. Plus, as Joanna said, it's not efficient in the sense that there are some households who do not want more food, they want something else. So it is more and more understood that providing food aid is not efficient compared to other types of aid. But as she said, it's also very difficult to have this statement understood by people who are altruistic but who want to make sure that it's food that is given and not something else. So,
thank you. And then we have a last question from Eva, who can raise her hand if she wants to. There, thank you. And it's a very interesting question, asking how we can control for all these unintended, unexpected consequences to achieve more positive impacts.
So we can't know everything from the beginning, but as I said, we can build a corpus of knowledge. And there are some people who are running what we call ex-ante evaluations. Ex-ante evaluations are really the idea that we are going to use as much information from other policies that have already been implemented to fine-tune what is the effect that this policy will have on the households, how they will behave when we give them $10, how they're going to spend those $10, and so on and so on. And you can try and run the ex-ante evaluation, so decide, build a model, basically, that's an economic model, in which you simulate the way the households are going to behave. Okay? And then you can change the parameters. So you can change how much you give them, you can change whether the amount you give is conditional on some school attendance, participation to healthcare, and so on, so that you have these different, the outcomes as much as you would like them to do, okay? This is, again, a normative statement on what we want to achieve, for sure. And so there are not so many studies like that, but the studies that I know who have been doing that actually find fairly good results in the sense that they find very close results compared to the experiment that had been run. So it seems that we can really do this exercise, use as much as we know from the way the people behave in order to understand what is going to happen afterwards when we, for instance, provide the cash transfer. Yes?
So I have another question based on that. Like, and I'm wondering why don't the established donors take that into account? Why don't they do that way? And how can we make them aware of those findings so that they can take it into account in their
I mean, it's difficult to know exactly what is done. I mean, in some poor countries, we still have ministries, and they are having some people working there. So maybe some of the policies have been fine-tuned. For instance, if you look at this program, where you might think, oh, but that was so obvious that they would increase their fertility rate because they are getting some payments for each birth. It's still the case that they haven't allowed for payments after the second child in some of the states. So they might have foreseen that. It's a bit difficult to know how they really decide to implement the policies. But yes, I mean, it should be done systematically, ex-ante evaluations. But it's also the case that in lots of institutions, they are trying to do something different, something better. So it's also the idea that this something different has never been done before, and therefore we can base our intervention on what we already know.
Yeah, thank you so much. Unfortunately, the time has run up. I think for the political answer to that, this kind of conference where people like us who want to work on evidence-based measurement is one of the steps that should be done. Thank you for your participation, and thank you a lot for Christelle for this awesome talk and the examples.